Thank you for joining us tonight. We are currently playing our pre-event slideshow. Gold text on a white background. Live from NYPL logo. Live from NYPL presents All We Can Save. Camille Dungy, Rhiana Gunn-Wright, Ayana Elizabeth Johnson, Sarah Stillman, and Jane Zelikova. October 13th, 2020 at 8 p.m. EDT. This slide features an image of the book jacket. Blue text on a peach-colored background reads, All We Can Save, Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis, edited by Ayana Elizabeth Johnson and Katharine K. Wilkinson. There is a painted yellow sunburst in the center of the cover, with rays emanating out in all directions. Black text on a white background. All We Can Save is available for purchase online from the library shop, nypl.org/shop. Proceeds benefit the New York Public Library. Plus, receive a free commemorative 125th anniversary tote bag with your purchase. Black text on a white background. This slide also has the image of the All We Can Save book jacket, along with the Simply E logo. Reserve a copy of All We Can Save for free with a New York Public Library card, available through Simply E on iOS and Android. Black text on a white background. This slide features the same image of the All We Can Save book jacket. This title and more are available in accessible formats for community members who do not use standard print. Find out more at nypl.org/talkingbooks. Black text on a white background. Recommended reading. Check out these selections from an essential climate crisis reading list compiled by the editors of All We Can Save. Sacred Instructions, Indigenous Wisdom for Living Spirit-Based Change by Sherry Mitchell, Wanahamugwaset. Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change, Changing Worlds by Adrienne Marie Brown. Check out these titles and more on Simply E. Accessible formats available through nypl.org/talkingbooks. View the rest of the list at bit.ly/climate-reads. Black text on a white background. Read, think, vote. Make an informed decision. Read as if your vote depends on it. NYPL's 2020 election reading list is available at nypl.org/election2020. This slide features a blue box with a line of red, white, and blue stars running across the middle, and images of 12 different book jackets from the election reading list, including America for Americans, Our Time is Now, The End of Ice, Begin Again, No Justice in the Shadows, This Changes Everything, Drawing the Vote, Unrigged, Good Talk, Give Us the Ballot, Why We're Polarized, and Push Out. Black text on a white background, live from NYPL Election Edition. Thursday, October 15th, 7 p.m. EDT. Political Roundtable with the New York Review of Books. As the 2020 election swings into view, contributors to the New York Review of Books examine and debate our moment of political division and crisis. Featuring Jamel Bowie, Pamela Karlan, Mark Lilla, Timothy Snyder, and Brenda Wineapple. For more information and to register, visit nypl.org/live. Thank you for joining us tonight. We are currently playing our pre-event slideshow. Gold text on a white background. Live from NYPL logo. Live from NYPL presents All We Can Save. Camille Dungy, Rhiana Gunn-Wright, Ayana Elizabeth Johnson, Sarah Stillman, and Jane Zelikova. October 13th, 2020 at 8 p.m. EDT. This slide features an image of the book jacket. Blue text on a peach-colored background reads, All We Can Save, Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis, edited by Ayana Elizabeth Johnson and Katharine K. Wilkinson. There is a painted yellow sunburst in the center of the cover, with rays emanating out in all directions. Black text on a white background. All We Can Save is available for purchase online from the library shop, nypl.org/shop. Proceeds benefit the New York Public Library. Plus, receive a free commemorative 125th anniversary tote bag with your purchase. Black text on a white background. This slide also has the image of the All We Can Save book jacket, along with the Simply E logo. Reserve a copy of All We Can Save for free with a New York Public Library card, available through Simply E on iOS and Android. Black text on a white background. This slide features the same image of the All We Can Save book jacket. This title and more are available in accessible formats for community members who do not use standard print. Find out more at nypl.org/talkingbooks. Black text on a white background. Recommended reading. Check out these selections from an essential climate crisis reading list compiled by the editors of All We Can Save. Sacred Instructions, Indigenous Wisdom for Living Spirit-Based Change by Sherry Mitchell, Wanahamugwaset. Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change, Changing Worlds by Adrienne Marie Brown. Check out these titles and more on Simply E. Accessible formats available through nypl.org/talkingbooks. View the rest of the list at bit.ly/climatereads. Black text on a white background. Read, think, vote. Make an informed decision. Read as if your vote depends on it. NYPL's 2020 election reading list is available at nypl.org/election2020. This slide features a blue box with a line of red, white, and blue stars running across the middle, and images of 12 different book jackets from the election reading list, including America for Americans, Our Time is Now, The End of Ice, Begin Again, No Justice in the Shadows, This Changes Everything, Drawing the Vote, Unrigged, Good Talk, Give Us the Ballot, Why We're Polarized, and Push Out. Black text on a white background, live from NYPL Election Edition. Thursday, October 15th, 7 p.m. EDT. Political Roundtable with the New York Review of Books. As the 2020 election swings into view, contributors to the New York Review of Books examine and debate our moment of political division and crisis. Featuring Jamel Bowie, Pamela Karlan, Mark Lilla, Timothy Snyder, and Brenda Wineapple. For more information and to register, visit nypl.org/live.
Well, hi, everyone. I am Faye Rosenfeld, and I'm the Vice President of Public Programs at the New York Public Library. I am so happy to welcome you to Live from NYPL, which tonight is all about a magnificent and important new book, All We Can Save: Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis. We are thrilled that the book's co-editor, marine biologist and policy expert Ayana Elizabeth Johnson will be joining us this evening, along with some of the book's contributors, including the poet Camille Dungy, Rhiana Gunn-Wright, Director of Climate Policy at the Roosevelt Institute and one of the architects of the Green New Deal, Sarah Stillman, New Yorker staff writer and Director of the Global Migration Project at the Columbia Journalism School, and Jane Zelikova, Chief Scientist at Carbon 180 and co-founder of 500 Women Scientists. For those of you not yet familiar with the book, All We Can Save is a wide-ranging collection of essays, poetry, journalism, and art produced by dozens of diverse women who are all at the forefront of the movement for climate justice. In the words of the co-editors, Ayana Johnson and Katharine Wilkinson, this book imparts the minds and hearts of women leading the way on climate and using their diverse gifts to, as Adrienne Rich writes, reconstitute the world. They are a small subset of a mighty community showing up in this moment, gathering the pieces of a broken world, doing the work of mending. If you don't own it already, you can purchase All We Can Save from the library's shop at nypl.org/shop. And you can also find the link in the Zoom app and in the YouTube chat. Excuse me. And all purchases made at our shop do benefit the New York Public Library. Before I invite our guests onto our virtual stage, I have a couple of just very quick housekeeping items to mention to you. First, I have to tell you that tonight's event is being recorded. That is to say, not you, only the event itself, those of us who are on screen. Second, our speakers will take your questions at the end. So if you have a question, you can ask it at any time during the conversation by typing it into the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom app, or into the chat in YouTube, or you can also email publicprograms@nypl.org. And while you're in the chat, we hope you'll say hello, let us know where you're tuning in from, and also what you're reading. Third, real-time captions are available for tonight's program via stream text. You can find the link to that in the reminder email that you received after signing up for tonight, as well as in the chats in Zoom and in YouTube. And fourth, I want to tell you just quickly about some of our upcoming events that I hope you'll be able to attend. This Thursday, October 15th, which was supposed to be the evening of a presidential debate, we are hosting a political roundtable with the New York Review of Books, featuring New York Review of Books contributors Jamel Bowie, Pamela Carlin, Brenda Wineapple, Mark Lilla, and Timothy Snyder. Next Tuesday, October 20th, Laila Lalami will join us to talk about her new book, Conditional Citizens, on Belonging in America, and she'll be speaking with Fatima Bhutto. On October 26th, Tamara Payne will speak with the Reverend Calvin O. Butts about The Dead Are Arising, the posthumously released biography of Malcolm X. This is a book that her late father, the journalist Les Payne, worked on for 3 decades, and it's now a finalist for the National Book Awards. So you can find all these events and many more by going to nypl.org/live, and also by signing up for the library's newsletter, Connect. Last but not least, don't forget that many of our branches are now open for grab and go service. So please reserve a book or several books online, visit your local branch to pick it up, and say hello to your wonderful librarians. In a few minutes, Ayana Johnson is going to speak with Rhiana Gunn-Wright, Sarah Stillman, and Jane Zelikova. But first, a reading by Camille Dungy, poet and contributor to All We Can Save.
Hello. My name's Camille Dungy, and I'm going to be reading you a poem from my book, Tropha Cascade. Characteristics of life. A fifth of animals without backbones could be at risk of extinction, say scientists. BBC Nature News. Ask me if I speak for the snail, and I will tell you, I speak for the snail. I speak of underneathedness and the welcome of mosses, of life that springs up, little lives that pull back and wait for a moment. I speak for the damselfly, water skeet, mollusk, the caterpillar, the beetle, the spider, the ant. I speak from the time before spinelessness was frowned upon. Ask me if I speak for the moon jelly. I will tell you one thing today and another tomorrow, and I will be as consistent as anything alive on this earth. I move as the currents move, with the breezes. What part of your nature drives you? You in your cubicle ought to understand me. I filter and filter and filter all day. Ask me if I speak for the nautilus, and I will be silent as the nautilus shell on a shelf. I can be beautiful and useless, if that's all you know to ask of me. Ask me what I know of longing, and I will speak of distances between meadows of night blooming flowers. I will speak the impossible hope of the firefly. You, with the candle burning and only one chair at your table, must understand such wordless desire. To say it is mindless is missing the point. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. As someone who has read that poem probably 40 times, and it is such a treat to hear Camille read it. This is the first time I've heard it read by her. So I just wanted to start by welcoming you all and by sharing a little bit about the book as a whole before we bring on our incredible panelists. And I think, poetry is a good place to start. We don't often think of poetry when we think about the climate crisis or books about it. And that is something that Katharine, my co-editor, and I thought really needed to change. And so the book is divided into 8 different sections. Each section has 4 or 5 essays, 2 poems, a few quotes. Each section opens with an original illustration. And that is by design because this is a tough topic, right? The climate crisis, all of the things we have to sort of process and deal with, all of the stories and narratives, it can sometimes start to feel heavy or complicated or overwhelming. And poetry has always been a tool for people to process their emotions, a moment to take a breath between other things, and a way to be reminded that you're not alone in the most elegant way possible. So poetry actually plays a very important role in this book. And so we're so glad that Camille could share her words with us. Especially because it is a book that Camille edited, an anthology called the Eco Justice Poetry Anthology, within which we found a number of the poems that we then licensed to appear in this collection. So All We Can Save is an anthology with essays from 41 women who are experts and leaders on climate, 17 poets, an illustrator, quotes from lots of other people. We wanted to fit in as many voices as we could. And the overall motivation for creating this anthology was Katharine and I were at the Aspen Institute, frustrated with the same small group of white men who had the money, who had the power, who were deciding who was going to get the microphones. And this is far too big a challenge to let any one group of people have all the control over deciding the future of, life on Earth for humanity, to put it mildly. And so we thought it would be an opportunity by collecting all of these voices into one book to say, actually, there are dozens and dozens of incredible women who are leading on climate, incredible women of color, and these are people that we all need to be listening to. So thank you for joining us to follow in that vein and to listen to some of the experts who appear within the book. So very briefly, I'll just introduce the panelists. So Rhiana Gunn-Wright is a policy expert and Chicago native who helped develop the Green New Deal. She is the director of climate policy at the Roosevelt Institute and a 2013 Rhodes Scholar. So Rhiana, thank you for being here. We also have Sarah Stillman with us tonight. She's a staff writer for The New Yorker, and she launched the Global Migration Project at Columbia Journalism School. She also teaches writing at Yale University and is a MacArthur Fellow. So you're getting the hint here, a bunch of slouches. And Jane Zelikova is our third panelist tonight. Dr. Jane Zelikova, she's an ecologist working at the intersection of climate change science, policy, and communication. In addition to her scientific research, she is the chief scientist at Carbon 180 and the co-founder of a nonprofit organization called 500 Women Scientists. So thank you all for being here. This is so exciting because the diversity of your expertise is exactly sort of what we wanted to shine through in this collection. So Jane, because your work is so clearly at this intersection of feminism and science and climate, I'd love you to start just by sharing a little bit about your work and how you approach climate by intertwining all 3 of those things.
Yeah, thanks, Ayana. That is a great question. So my training is in climate science and ecosystem kind of science and ecology. And that is just inherently an interdisciplinary training. I mean, ecology is about intersecting relationships between organisms, plants, soil critters, the atmosphere. So I think even in my training, I was prepared to bring a lot of different topics together. And to be very honest, I think it's really hard to work on a global problem like climate change and ignore all of the other factors. I think what you said resonates for me. I've been in a lot of rooms, like the room that you described at the Aspen Institute is an all too common experience for me, where I'm often one of the only women, certainly surrounded by a lot of people that have the power and the resources to address the problem, and yet sort of are so invested in their ideas and their own solutions that they don't incorporate the ideas of other people. So from a science perspective, I know that can't be successful because, in ecology, we know that diversity is really important. We know that diverse ecosystems are ecosystems that are resilient to change, that can withstand kind of the ebbs and flow of climate, and diversity is just really important. So it's always been really weird to me to not see that reflected in how people are thinking about ecological problems and problems like climate change. So it just makes sense from a science perspective that we need lots of ideas in the room if we're going to be tackling this complicated issue. And then from a perspective of being a feminist, I don't think I knew that I was a feminist. I just always didn't like injustice. And so I think naturally that kind of made me feminist. I didn't arrive to it by scholarship. I didn't study women's studies. It just sort of made sense because I wanted more people in the room, and I saw that there were a lot of people that weren't invited, and that to me is a feminist issue.
Mm-hmm. So Sarah, you this was your first essay writing explicitly about climate. You let us twist your arm to sort of bring you into the fold, which is so exciting to me, because you've had a career of talking about other justice issues, in particular criminal justice and immigration or migration, as you tackled here in this essay that you wrote for the anthology. And I'd love to hear from you just what was that like, or is that like, to now be incorporating climate into your journalism?
Yeah, I love the welcoming, capacious nature of the book. You're bringing us all into the fold with the way you edited it. And I think for me, some of it was realizing that I had been reporting on climate for a decade before I knew I was reporting on climate. Essentially, I was covering issues around deportations and mass deportations in the US, even prior to the Trump administration, building a database of people who had come here seeking asylum and who had instead been deported and then killed after their deportations. So pretty grim topic. And what I started to see is that we had this incredibly antiquated asylum system and this really antiquated ideas about who deserves protection and who doesn't. And a lot of that was predicated on these ideas that kind of grew out of a 1951 kind of post-World War II landscape where it made sense to delineate, these 5 sets of people deserve protection. If you were persecuted due to your religion, if you were persecuted due to your nationality. And what I was seeing when I was listening to the stories of people at the border is that sometimes people came, fleeing gang violence or things that didn't fit exactly into the legal norms. But oftentimes, increasingly more and more, you're seeing people who are fleeing untenable living situations that are inextricably bound up in climate. And we really don't have a legal fabric for protecting those folks. And to me, that feels like it's already critical and urgent, but obviously we know that this is, the climate crisis is upon us and is going to be becoming more and more urgent. So I was really, I didn't want to shy away from the challenge you posed to me, which is how do we start to imagine a better, more creative way of thinking about protection in the context of migration and climate. Mm-hmm. So it was a good challenge, and I feel like a baby step because it's actually pretty shocking when you look at what's out there, how little language we have for this problem and how few policy solutions at this stage we have.
Yeah, one of the things you sort of tackle in your piece is this term of a climate refugee is kind of like not the right term. And so Sarah's essay is called Like the Monarch, and I actually just wanted to to read a little bit of it for you. I don't know how often you have your own words read to you, Sarah, but here goes nothing. Speaking to asylum seekers at the southern border and elsewhere, I've noticed climate migration is rarely reducible to a single variable. Recently, I spoke to a young mother in Mogadishu, Somalia, whose husband, Ahmed Salah, had presented himself at a port of entry in South Texas to seek asylum. His problem's roots were gnarled. He'd fled conflict in Somalia, where drought has fueled food scarcity, which in turn has worsened armed conflict. He'd sought safety elsewhere in Africa, but finding little of it, he journeyed thousands of miles across Latin America, trekking to the United States as his best hope of freedom. He was apprehended and detained. Eventually, he went before a judge in Louisiana who had a 100% asylum deportation rate. All day in court, she rejected each case before her. Salah proved no different. The judge rejected his asylum claim and sent him back to Somalia. There, last March, he died in a car bombing. Climate change doesn't just spur migration. It makes pre-existing migrant communities more exposed to extreme weather. As director of the Global Migration Project at Columbia Journalism School, I worked with a team of 3 postgraduate fellows to document this trend. We spoke to more than 200 climate scientists, migration experts, legal scholars, and migrant communities on 5 continents. Some of the reasons we found for this disproportionate impact were obvious. From Bosnia to Kenya to Bangladesh, refugees tend to live in precarious housing, like tent cities and plywood shacks and makeshift camps. They're often at the mercy of the elements as a result. Undocumented communities may decline to seek help from authorities when a storm or fire strikes, fearing arrest or deportation. The same is true of post-disaster aid. But elsewhere, we found surprises. The Global Migration Project team traveled to the Bahamas after Hurricane Dorian struck in September of 2019. Amid the devastation in the Abaco Islands, we learned about a large Haitian immigrant population living in so-called shantytowns, ravaged by the record-breaking storm. In the aftermath, the government promised Haitian migrants shelter and aid, free of repercussions. But within a matter of weeks, immigration authorities began a campaign to round up, arrest, detain, and deport hundreds of undocumented Haitian storm survivors, sending them back to a country facing political unrest and its own climate instability. Many women alleged sexual assault and verbal abuse in the process. Some were pregnant or nursing or caring for small children who'd been born in the Bahamas, but who were deported nonetheless to Haiti, a country they'd never seen. We are not just living in the age of the climate refugee. We are also witnessing the advent of the climate deportee. And that last bit there was something that I'd never really thought about before. And just, Sarah, in those 4 paragraphs, 3 paragraphs, you really show how all of these things are intertwined. And I think you have another piece coming out soon about these intersections. Do you want to give us a little teaser? Is that allowed?
Sure, yeah. It's actually about this very issue about the climate deportee. And it's a good example of why it matters so much to listen to people on the ground in the communities that are most affected. Because we did not go down to the Bahamas thinking we were going to tell a story about that. We thought we were going to talk about all the many migrants who left during Hurricane Dorian when it hit last September. Some of you may have seen in the news, there were some pretty horrible stories of people who had tried to flee the Bahamas, came to the US, including children who were separated from the family members with whom they came and put in deportation proceedings. So we thought we were going to go and tell that story. Then we got on the ground and we found out about this massive number of undocumented Haitian people, and also kids who've been born in the Bahamas to Haitian parents who had been essentially, as you just read, promised, hey, don't worry, come to our shelters, you'll be protected, and who are instead deported en masse to Haiti. And I think we also see a similar dynamic in the US. I mean, if you look at what's happening in recent storms, there's a lot of people in our country who do not feel safe seeking shelter on account of their undocumented status. I also literally just this past week got back from a trip to Louisiana, where I was following a group of workers that was actually inspired by the essay I wrote for this piece. I was following undocumented workers who are rebuilding after hurricanes, who move from one hurricane to the next. And a lot of the people I spoke to this past week are sleeping in a Home Depot parking lot and being harassed every night by the police, and having to move to another parking lot where they're going to sleep on any given night because they're doing the difficult work of rebuilding after our climate crises. So I think there's so many communities that have been left out of the conversation around climate migration, things we haven't even pictured and things we need to make sure we're listening to people on the ground about to even know the right, as I mentioned, the right language for talking about, to say nothing of finding more humane and dignified approaches.
So I'm glad you're telling a story about what's happening in the US, because I think for so long we Americans have had the luxury often of thinking that the climate crisis is affecting poor people, brown people, somewhere far away, that it's not something we really have to worry about. But I think, it's become so clear, especially in the last few years, for those who have had the privilege until now to ignore the impacts of climate, that it's here, and it's coming for all of us unless we really turn things around. And so, Rhiana, this is something that you write and speak so eloquently about, and in your leadership of crafting what a Green New Deal would mean for the U.S. Certainly thinking about these same issues that Jane and Sarah talked about, but how that would actually translate into policy. Like, how do we change the rules of the game so we have a chance of actually succeeding and building a future that has a place for everyone? And so I know you get interviewed all the time, and I don't want to ask you the questions that you always get asked. And so I'm curious just to hear from you, what's next? So you helped to architect the initial Green New Deal, sort of like policy memo and resolution. And what are you working on next? What's the next iteration of that?
Well, it still feels like we're in the first iteration because we haven't actually done it yet. So a lot of this iteration is still about building the power to get a Green New Deal passed, as well as thinking about how the Green New Deal fits in the moment that we have and the things that are going to be happening. So, for instance, we're in a recession, right? And because of the way, in large part because of the way the federal government has handled it, it'll likely be a long and slow recovery. So part of the thinking now is, if there's going to be a big stimulus package and the Green New Deal is in part about investing in a bunch of new industries, how do you what parts of the Green New Deal fit in an economic recovery plan? How do we use that, the need to invest, right, and to create millions of jobs to address this recession, to actually help build a Green New Deal, right? And how do we use that to invest in green stimulus measures? So that's a lot of my work right now, actually, thinking about essentially climate action as fiscal policy, as economic policy. And then a lot of the other work that I'm embarking on is around a jobs guarantee, right? Around really questions of, we know that there's a set of institutions that we're going to need for something like a Green New Deal, and how do we design those out? Again, like Sarah said, not based on what we think the problems are, but on what the problems actually are, and trying to think about and figure out what the problems are on the ground and how do we address those through these institutions. So in lots of ways, I think it's just a continuation, but it's moving from a framework to trying to figure out how to sort of break down this really giant thing into pieces that we can implement as part of an economic recovery, and just sort of ongoing.
And so I I have so many, obviously, like I want to talk to you about policy all day. You know this about me. I will spare the rest of the crowd that. Rhiana is good at many, many things. She claims that one of them is not reading out loud. So she's offered me the chance to read a portion of her essay. But before I do that, I would love for you to just tell folks like, what is the Green New Deal? Because we hear this term a lot, but I don't think everybody like knows what it actually is.
Yeah, so the Green New Deal is a proposal for a 10-year economic mobilization that has three goals: creating millions of jobs, reducing emissions, and redressing economic and social inequities, right? And helping to build a more equitable and just economy. And so a lot of people get confused because they're like, is it legislation? Is it a bill? There was a congressional resolution that basically sketched out the framework of a Green New Deal. But the Green New Deal is, like I said, it's a policy proposal. It's essentially a governing agenda for a decade with those three goals in mind. The Green New Deal that I've worked on is really focused on the US, but there's other Green New Deals, right, at various levels. There are Green New Deals in other countries. There's some Green New Deals at like the state level. So Maine has passed one, New York has something people call their Green New Deal, and then cities have passed versions. So LA has a Green New Deal. And so
EU has a Green New Deal. They call it the European Green Deal. It's not.
Yeah.
They skipped the new part and just
Yeah.
deal. Yeah.
So the EU has a Green Deal, and so that's also really interesting because it's also now sort of a global concept where when people are like, "What's the Green New Deal?" I'm like, "Well, it depends on who you're asking and where you are."
Yeah.
But they're all sort of joined by an emphasis on decarbonization and sort of changing and economic transformation. Some of them are more or less interested in justice.
So Rhiana, you are extremely interested in justice, which is
I am.
So this is a pro justice panel. Sorry if justice offends any of the 183 of you who are so lovely to join us this evening. But Rhiana's essay is called A Green New Deal for All of Us. And she starts by saying, I'm just going to read a few paragraphs from separate parts of it. You're going to have to see how they all tie together on your own. People often ask me why I decided to help develop the Green New Deal. Why did I, a 20-something Black woman, think I could help develop a policy proposal to address something as big as climate change? Often, I think they expect some grand story about incredible courage and audacity, or deep ambition, or sometimes a master plan for the revolution. The truth is that I was scared and I really needed a job. I have spent my entire life trying to rewrite systems of power, and policy is nothing if not a system for creating and distributing power. That is why, contrary to popular belief, the most important part of a policy proposal is not the details, at least not at the beginning. It's the vision that the policy presents and the story it tells. The best policy proposals, that is, the proposals that move the most people to fight for them, present a clear narrative about what went wrong, why it went wrong, and how the government plans to fix it. The climate crisis is entangled with other crises named in the Green New Deal resolution. Life expectancy declining, basic needs out of the reach of many, the greatest income inequality since the 1920s, a large racial wealth divide, a gender earnings gap, and systemic injustices that have been exacerbated by pollution, environmental destruction, and climate change. The Green New Deal emerges from an analysis of the climate crisis that identifies it as a consequence of systems: neoliberalism, strategic racism, unfettered capitalism, and their interaction, rather than simply as a consequence of greenhouse gas emissions. That is why the Green New Deal attempts to respond not only to the identified crises, climate and otherwise, but also to the economic and social disruption that will inevitably result from a massive effort to transition away from fossil fuels. And so the thing that I appreciate the most about your work, Rhiana, is your insistence that we solve problems as they actually exist in the world and not as some oversimplified version of the world we wished we lived in, right? Because if we only focus on emissions, it's just not going to get us there.
Yeah, totally. And I think part of it for me is also recognizing who those simplifications serve. Who is served by living in a two-dimensional world, right? Especially when the parts that get stomped out are usually the parts that are really vital and important to folks like me and you and a bunch of people, right, on this call. And really, I mean, everyone's served by more 3D sort of grappling with things, but truly, like, silos are about control and delineation and disciplines. And when you think about that, how many times have people who were marginalized or oppressed benefited from those things? Never, really. So I just feel like the more time we spend in those silos, one, the less time you actually have to come up with solutions, but also we're just sticking ourselves with an unlevel playing field that's going to keep us going back, right, to those same white men in those same rooms that we keep having to go back to.
Yeah, as Katharine, my co-editor, says, the climate crisis is a leadership crisis. And it's just clear that we haven't had all of the leaders we need, right? There are obviously people who have done very important and meaningful work, but it's going to take a lot more than that. And so I think this is an exciting opportunity to think about what everyone can bring to the table, right? What a journalist can bring, what a policy expert can bring, what a scientist can bring. We've tended to think about the climate crisis as mostly a technical issue. And Jane, your work is so incredible because you do the science work on which we can base policy, but then you also, engage in this broader public conversation. So I'd love to hear from your perspective, and maybe how it's evolved, the role that science plays in this year and in this moment that we're in now, for how we can successfully address the climate crisis.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I think if nothing else, science can help us create a plan. And science is such a big term, right? Like, I'm an ecologist and that's a science, but my work isn't really grounded in like human systems so much. So working with social sciences, economics, folks like Rhiana who are developing policy, folks like Sarah who are writing about like the bigger context in which we're working is really important. So, I mean, if nothing else, we have a crisis of leadership and we have a crisis of trust in information. And I think science is definitely one of those things that has suffered as a result. And it didn't happen organically. There are entities that benefit a lot from sowing distrust in science and in information. They benefit a lot from delaying action based on scientific evidence. But I think if nothing else, science helps us form a plan and try stuff. And it might be that we have to try a bunch of different things. That's certainly what's going to happen. And some of the things we try will work and some of the things we try won't. That's kind of the amazing process of doing science, is trying different things and figuring out what works best. Every climate solution has some downsides. That's one of the things that I've been learning as I've been working on these topics at the intersection of working on climate science and climate policy. And policy is really, if you're creating really robust, sustainable, fair, just, and safe policy, you have to be thinking about those unintended consequences and what might happen. when you deploy any climate solution. Every single solution has downsides, and you have to think through what is going to happen. And science can help because we do experiments. One of the things I love about being a scientist is getting to go out in the world and try things and set up experiments, collect data, and then sit in front of my computer and graph things. I know that's really weird, but that is where my joy comes from. Yeah, that is where I find the joy. And for solving or even remotely addressing the climate crisis, we need to have as many people doing those experiments and trying things as we can, and not being invested in any one particular idea or solution, because we know there is no single solution. And if nothing else, like, science can help us figure out all the different ways that we can go, and then do the experiments, look at the data, look at the evidence, and find a way forward that minimizes impacts on ecosystems, vulnerable communities. I think it's just like, it has a role to play, and I think it's been pushed to the margins for quite a long time, and it's time for it to take center stage again.
Obviously, I agree. And I can certainly relate as a marine biologist by training. People always ask me stuff about science, and I'm like, not my science. Even freshwater, I'm like, I don't know. I only know like a small subset of things about salty water. And so I think what you're bringing to this conversation is really interesting because of your work. Right now, your scientific research is focused on soil and agriculture. And we know that we have to transform the way that we grow food in this country in order to, transition from an industry that is part of the climate problem to one that's part of the solution. And so Jane's essay in the book is called Solutions Underfoot. And she has not yet received her copies in the book because she is joining us from Alaska and her books are in Colorado. So I get the pleasure of reading Jane's words too. This is like the best. Hopefully other people are enjoying this as much as I am. So yeah, Jane wrote this incredible essay about soil. Microbes are the movers and shakers of carbon sequestration. They transform organic matter from plants and animals into soil carbon and other nutrients, a process that builds soil fertility and draws down carbon from the atmosphere and locks it away. How do microbes do their alchemy? To understand microbes, you have to understand plants. From giant sequoias to microscopic cyanobacteria, from lush coastal rainforests to arid rangelands, photosynthetic organisms drive the single most important chemical transformation of carbon on our planet. Plants are proverbial straws that suck in carbon dioxide from the air through photosynthesis. Combined with water and sunshine, plants transform carbon dioxide into carbon building blocks. With each sunrise, plants kick photosynthesis into high gear, and as the sun sets, carbon drawdown ceases until dawn. With the advent of new instruments, we can now observe the Earth's daily gas exchange cycle in real time, the culmination of billions of individuals that exhale carbon dioxide and all the plants across the world that absorb it to power photosynthesis. Plants don't use every ounce of carbon they capture through photosynthesis for their growth. The extra seeps out of roots into soil as exudates, a secretion hungry soil microbes consume. Microbes use some of the exudates for their own growth, keeping that carbon underground, and release some back into the atmosphere. Plant roots not only directly feed carbon to microbes, but also stimulate the creation of pores, small pockets between soil particles and clumps. Scientists have only recently discovered how important these soil pores are for carbon storage. Locking away carbon in pores or in clusters of soil particles protects it from being consumed and partially exhaled by microbes. It turns out that the bulk of carbon stored is actually dead microbes, known as microbial necromass. Having more carbon in the soil is transformative. It means better water infiltration and higher nutrient and water retention. As soil health improves, agricultural fields become more resilient to the ups and downs of a changing climate. That resilience helps plants grow more consistently, even when the weather is fickle. To put it simply, Healthy soils matter now more than ever. So as the daughter of a farmer, I have learned to love soils a tiny fraction of the amount that you do. And I think it's such a joy to have this ode to the wee beasties, as you call these microbes, appear in a climate book. So is there anything else you wanted to share about soil science and the way that you see agriculture transforming, or yeah, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that makes me most excited on a daily basis is that soils are getting their day in the spotlight, that people are really psyched about soils and microbes, actually, more than they were even when I started kind of working on this stuff about 10 years ago. And certainly since I've been working on climate policy for the last 5. And I think it's, of all the things that are controversial in our day-to-day lives, I think soils are one of those things that we can agree and can bring people together, because everyone eats, and soils are literally the foundation of our food systems, at least food systems that are terrestrial, not ocean. And everyone can thank a farmer. And when I think about people that are really excited about the potential to harness the power of soils to help address the climate crisis, most of them are farmers and ranchers. These are folks that have been largely left out of the climate solutions conversation until recently. And I think if we want to build a really big climate tent where everyone is invited and welcome, we can't really go forward if we don't invite farmers and ranchers in to join us.
Mm-hmm.
And soils, I think, are a way for us to do that.
Yeah. So there is an essay in the anthology by a farmer, Leah Penniman, and by an ocean farmer, Emily Stengel, whose organization is focused on growing seaweeds and shellfish. And so as we were curating this book, we were trying to show as many of these different ways to contribute to climate solutions as we could, because sort of my perception of the climate movement or the environmental movement is that it hasn't really welcomed in enough people. Yes, in terms of, racial diversity, in terms of gender diversity, but also just in terms of like what you're good at. And so we've been asking everyone, like, could you march? Could you donate? Could you vote? Could you, call your politicians? Everyone's asked to do the same list of things. Whereas obviously Rhiana should be working on policy, and Sarah should be telling the stories, and Jane should be doing the science and making sure that the journalists and the policymakers hear the science. And I think that's what's so exciting about where we finally are in climate work, is that we've sort of acknowledged that we have to transform not only electricity, right? This is not just solar panels and electric cars, but our entire electricity, our entire transportation, buildings, agriculture, land use, manufacturing. So we're going to need all of these different skills. And so it's so exciting to have the three of you on a panel really representing a good swath of the types of expertise that are needed here. And with the 41 essays sort of as 41 different doors into climate work, into ways that you can contribute. And so there are 2 appendices in the book. One is a list of all the existing climate solutions from Project Drawdown, where Katharine is vice president and editor-in-chief, just to show people the breadth of things we already have at our fingertips that we can implement. And then the other is a list of all the organizations who are mentioned in the book who are doing important work, because there's an opportunity to join people who are doing this stuff and not just do it alone, because we can't do it alone. So on that note, I would love to take some questions. I know we've got some questions coming in here. Okay. So our first question, for whoever's feeling excited about this one: what advice would you give to young women activists, scientists, and conservationists starting their careers?
I have a really easy one. Find your people. Find your squad, find your girl gang, find your people, and do it together. That's what I've done. I've always had this amazing community of women. First it was women scientists, now it's women climate leaders. And I think being a part of a group is really wonderful. So find your people.
It's a good question. I mean, Jane's completely right. I think the other thing that I would say is, I don't know, you're probably right more than you think you are, in the sense that, like, I think it's really healthy and good to take a step back, right, about your work and the things that you do, and to, you know, really kick the tires on your ideas. But I think often, at least for me and a lot of women that I know, the default is, especially if you think something different than everyone else or a lot of people in your field, I must be wrong, right? Like I'm off. But you're probably not, right? Like you're probably not. If you know, are generally a smart, thoughtful person, if it keeps bumping around in your head, there's something to it. So I would just say listen to yourself sooner than you think that you should.
And I love what you said, Ayana, about bringing people into the fold who I think so often, especially as women, we're trained to, as Rhiana just said, kind of not trust our own expertise. And knowing that you don't have to wait for permission. You've been so generous in bringing so many people. Like I wouldn't necessarily have, I never would have threw my hat in the ring to write a piece for this anthology had you not stuck your hand out in my direction. And how can we do that for each other? And also recognize the way, because this is such a fundamentally intersectional issue, realizing like, oh, okay, I didn't think I had climate expertise, but I had this migration expertise. I come from a labor union family and have this expertise around labor. And how do we all marshal, like you were saying before, our individual forms of like deep expertise and deep lived knowledge and experience into this arena? I think that that's such a thing we can do for ourselves, but also do for each other, for the people around us who we're trying to bring into these folds as well.
Yeah. I find that question to be so hard to answer because it just makes me want to ask whoever asked that question, like a lot of questions back. Like, well, what are you good at? Like, what will get you out of bed in the morning? Like, is it science? Is it policy? Like, is it communication? Is it just like, is it farming? Is it engineering? Is it like, do you want to be rappelling off a wind turbine and fixing it? Like, I don't know what's your jam, right? Because all of that is needed and more. Are you an artist? Are you an architect? And so I think that's the opportunity, is to sort of, is because we need to change everything, to lean into what you're good at and sort of the Venn diagram of like, what skills do you have? What sort of brings you joy, and the work that is needed. And so that's kind of how I try to think about mapping some of that. But yeah, definitely find your squad. And I think part of the challenge has been, there's like, because there hasn't been that many resources available for doing this work, there's been this like really destructive scarcity mentality, like competing for grants, competing for attention, competing to get your ideas heard. Whereas like, I think if each of us wrote our own books, I don't think that would have been, no one would have read 41 books. But also, you know, the wealth, it's the collective wealth of information, you know, of wisdom that's shared, that I think is so exciting. And we're in just like, I think that's the shift that we're seeing, is this new era of like, oh, it's going to take all of us. Okay, like maybe we're not competing. And so if you can just at the beginning of your career, think of this as like a lifelong collaboration, as opposed to something you're supposed to be individually good at, I think that will help too. Okay. How do you handle the anxiety and frustration that naturally comes from stagnation and obstruction from current leadership, especially given how unwieldy and massive this problem space is?
I can jump in. I think about this a lot, and it definitely comes in waves for me. Something that's really helped is realizing someone we I think all of us know Dr. Renee. I'm gonna mess up her name.
Kurtzman?
Lertzman. Okay. I remember having a conversation with her, and she talked about how one of the most common responses to climate anxiety is basically like hero fantasies, like a desire to like be the person that does the thing, and how many people and how often that ends up actually burning us out because none of us is going to be the person that fixes this. It's just like not possible. It's not a real thing. And so that's helped because when I sort of took that vantage point, I realized that like even if it wasn't, this current leadership presents a lot of problems, right? But even under the best leadership, I'm never going to be the hero, right? Like I'm not going to be the person who saved the day, nor am I single-handedly going to like get any of the changes that I want to see. I'm not going to be the person that achieves a Green New Deal because there isn't one person. And that's been really helpful, just recognizing that some of the feelings of smallness aren't necessarily anxiety, they're just fact, right? They're just the feeling of running up against a problem that is bigger than you are. And that's just part of being alive, right? Like that's just a thing that happens. And so that's been really helpful, taking myself away from feeling but responsible for everything and really just trying to focus on like what parts am I actually responsible for? And those tend to be, in the grand scheme of things, fairly small.
Yeah, Sarah, go ahead.
Well, I really appreciate what you just said, Rhiana, about the hero worship tendencies. I do think for me, it's also been so helpful to just connect to to history and to historical examples of collective action. I don't know, lately that has been feeding me deeply. And even the piece I wrote for the book, like I actually didn't even mention what it centered around, but I was writing about this case of a group of Indian workers who were essentially trafficked to rebuild the Gulf Coast after Hurricane Katrina. And these were workers who like risked a huge amount to basically stick their necks out, like organize collective action around the trafficking they were facing. And ultimately they won like one of the largest settlements in US trafficking court history, like upwards of $20 million against this company that had exploited them. And so to me, that's recent history, but I feel like we can go way back. And even you start the book with an amazing example of the climate feminists from the 1850s or something like that. And so I don't know, I'm drawing strength from the examples of like how people have marshaled like courage, even with great pain, that knowing that it doesn't have to not be painful, but that maybe is part of it, is really helpful to me.
I'll just add one last thing is because when you mentioned pain, Sarah, also just recognizing that like just because it's painful, it doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. Like so often, I think particularly in the US, we're taught that like pain is a symbol that or is a sign that you're wrong, that you're doing something wrong, that something is wrong with you, and you should try to keep it away from you. But the fact is that like yeah, it's a really tough situation. It's a really tough problem. It's painful. That's just a fact. And it's not fine, but it is a fact. And just like not seeing that as a problem, just recognizing that like it might be anxiety over the climate crisis, but anxiety happens in life, right? Like these things happen. This is not such a it's a like a really unique moment in history, but all the things that we're feeling are really human and really normal.
Maybe I'll just add one other quick thing. I agree with everything. And I especially like what Rhiana said earlier about breaking things down and then addressing them one at a time. I think for me, like when I think back to like writing my PhD dissertation, I had a lot of anxiety about that because it seemed so big and I felt so small in relation to it. And at least for me, that anxiety, like I had to make a plan. And then once I had a plan, I started making lists. And I know it's kind of nerdy, but then I made a plan and I made my list. And then I started just crossing things off. Slowly over time, I crossed off everything on the list. So I could take this thing that was really overwhelming and anxiety inducing to me and break it down into pieces that I could process. And some of them were still really scary and difficult, but just breaking it down into smaller pieces allowed me to address it in a way that I could actually process each piece and learn from it. So I don't know if you're one of those people that likes to make lists, make a plan or make a list. And then the other thing is just like talk about it with other people. You don't have to carry everything on your own.
There are so many great questions here. So we're just going to do a rapid fire last few. Someone writes that they spend a lot of time in boardrooms where people speak about how technologies will reduce carbon emissions, but they never hear about anyone speaking about the role of communities or justice. Any tips on how to raise awareness of the importance of intersectionality and a holistic approach to climate change? Anyone got a hot tip?
I often I think one of the best things to do is just intervene with questions like, okay, well, who's going to control those technologies? Who's going to have, how are they going to be regulated? This is going to reduce emissions, but what about the people in those communities? Just asking those questions, a lot of times people haven't thought about it. And so that can be a way to cue up for folks that, oh, there are other issues other than just this technology, right? But there's issues around that technology that we have to think about.
Sarah, how do you craft stories or narratives in a way to try to reach across the aisle in a politically divisive world?
I think I've given up on the old school journalistic objectivity. I'm all about this sea change in the journalistic integrity model, where it's all about like accountability driven reporting, where we're transparent about where we're coming from, but we're allowed to be human. We're allowed to bring our human selves to the table as writers, and that we're also allowed to be human centric in the storytelling models. So I love Venn diagrams, like the intersection point between the rich individual human stories, like when you deeply listen to what someone's actual experience of what it is like to like run from a hurricane, as I did last week, or listen to what it is like to chat with the worker in the parking lot of a Home Depot who just slept on the ground in front of the PetSmart in order to be able to rebuild someone's home the next day, to listen to that, but then also to bring in the systemic analysis. I feel like it's not enough to just tell the human stories. We have to be structural and systemic in the way we think about the causal factors undergirding those stories. So to me, oftentimes it's figuring out, how do I braid those two together? Like, where's the suspense in the human story, and how do I then interject the data, the systems analysis?
Jane, what is most important to teach young people about climate?
I think curiosity, just teaching them that asking lots of questions is a good thing, and never kind of squashing that constant, why is this happening, that kids bring when they're growing up and learning about the world. So I think more than anything, curiosity and thinking critically about the world.
So this is great, because the last question that we have time for is, what are each of you most curious about right now as relates to climate and climate feminism? Or are you just tired and like need a nap and don't actually have a curiosity that is
yeah. I'm tired. I'm curious how I'm get through tomorrow. That's what I'm curious about.
Yeah. I have like curiosity about weird, like, how do beavers overwinter? Because like, do they have air? Like, what happens in Alaska? Like, do they go underground? I also have questions about bears. All my questions are about like things that I don't know about, that aren't soils and microbes. They're just like, how does the rest of the world work? It's not really a climate question, but like it's related to climate. Yeah, my questions are weird. They're not like.
No, these are fabulous.
I mean, yeah.
Jane about ants. If you get Jane talking about ants, you will learn some incredible, miraculous things that will make you want to preserve the world. My curiosity is about, I would love to find someone who can really spell out for me a vision from climate crises in a world where we're all going to be on some level on the run and not necessarily feeling safe in our homes. That is an imaginary landscape that I feel like we are only beginning to enter, and I would love to hear people's ideas and thoughts on that. And I'm so grateful all the people who are joining on the call, like all the smart minds that are trying to wrap their heads around a legal framework that can accommodate that kind of justice.
Yeah. Well, this has been an absolute honor and a pleasure to gather with you all tonight. And I just wanted to close by sharing where the title of this book came from. We've all sort of talked around it over the last hour, and I think the subtitle, Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis, that to me is the trifecta we need, right? We have to face the truth, the facts, the science, the sort of like the hard realities of the world that we're living in and the changes that are coming. We can't just like retreat into our shells, but actually like be courageous and find ways to contribute and really focus on solutions. And so to me, that is such a powerful trifecta and a reminder for how we can really think about the work that needs doing. But the title itself, All We Can Save, actually came from a stanza of an Adrienne Rich poem. So I will close by reading that. My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I have to cast my lot with those who age after age, perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. And that is all we can save. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight.
Black text on white background, New York Public Library lion logo, 125 years. Learn more about the New York Public Library, nypl.org.